The grinding protest of steel on the steel was the first sound of Wyoming that truly registered. For hours, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels had been a lullaby of progress, a heartbeat carrying her away from a life that no longer fit and toward one she could only sketch in the vaguest outlines of hope. Now, that rhythm was dying, surrendering to a series of shuddering jerks and the long, mournful hiss of steam bleeding into the frigid air. Julia Arlen kept her gaze fixed on the window, though the view had been an unchanging canvas of gray and white for the better part of a day. The land was vast and unforgiving, a sweep of snow-dusted plains that rolled into low, sullen hills under a sky the color of dishwater. There were no gentle curves to this place, no soft edges. It was a country of sharp lines and stark truths. And a part of her, the part that had grown weary of polite fictions, was grimly satisfied by it. She felt the final lurch as the train settled into a groaning stillness. The conductor, a man with a walrus mustache and weary eyes, moved down the aisle, his voice a low rumble. "Whitestone. This is Whitestone Station." His words were not an announcement so much as a final, tired fact. Julia gathered her things, her movements deliberate and unhurried. There was no one to rush for, no crowd to push through. The passenger car was nearly empty, holding only a sleeping merchant, his head lolling against the grimy glass, and a small, huddled family near the stove, their faces pale with exhaustion. She pulled on her woolen gloves, the fabric thin from wear, and took a firm hold on the two possessions that constituted her entire worldly claim. In one hand, she held the handle of a heavy leather satchel, its surface cracked and scuffed from a journey that had begun a world away in Boston. Its weight was familiar, a solid, tangible anchor. In her other hand, she cradled a small oil lamp. It was made of brass, tarnished with age but meticulously cared for, its glass chimney clean and its wick freshly trimmed. It was a foolish thing to carry across a continent, perhaps, but it had been her mother's, and it was the only thing she owned that felt like a direct link to a time of warmth and light. Rising from the hard wooden bench, she was immediately conscious of her own presence, a feeling that had shadowed her for as long as she could remember. Julia Arlen was a tall woman. She stood just shy of 6 feet, a height that in the crowded, narrow streets of the East had been a constant source of comment, of tilted heads and whispered remarks. She had learned to carry her height not with defiance, but with a kind of quiet, resolute stillness, as if by minimizing her movements she could somehow shrink the space she occupied. She moved down the aisle, her head held straight, her gaze forward, a practiced defense against the stares she always anticipated. The step down from the train car was a high one, and as her worn leather boot met the snow-dusted planks of the platform, the cold was a physical shock. It was a different kind of cold than she had ever known. Not the damp, seeping chill of a Boston winter, but a dry, clean, piercing cold that seemed to find its way through every layer of her clothing to lay its icy hand directly on her skin. It stole the breath from her lungs and made her eyes water. She took a moment to steady herself, her knuckles white where she gripped the bag and the lamp. The platform was deserted. She had expected, she wasn't sure what she had expected, a bustling small-town station, perhaps, or at the very least, a man waiting. A man named Lyle Henderson. His letter, which she knew by heart, was tucked safely in an inner pocket of her coat. It had been brief and to the point, written in a strong, clear hand. He needed a bookkeeper for his horse ranch, the Triple Divide. He required someone with a mind for figures, meticulous and reliable. A mutual acquaintance in Chicago had provided her name. The letter had been a lifeline. It was the first time an offer had come to her based purely on her stated abilities, with no questions about her suitability, her temperament, or her appearance. He hadn't asked if she was of a delicate constitution. He hadn't inquired after her marital status, and he had never seen her, had never had the chance to let his eyes widen slightly, the way most men's did, as she unfolded to her full, considerable height. For that, she had been profoundly grateful. He had written, "The train arrives at 3. I will be there to meet you." Julia looked up at the pale, washed-out sun. It hung low in the western sky, offering little warmth, and she guessed it was well past 3 already. Perhaps the train had been late. She scanned the length of the platform again. It was a simple, stark structure of weathered wood, running alongside a single track that disappeared into the white emptiness in either direction. At the far end stood a small, unpainted station house, a thin curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney. Other than that, there was nothing. No bench, no baggage cart, no station master tipping his hat, and no Mr. Henderson. The train behind her gave a great sigh of steam, followed by a series of metallic clangs that echoed unnervingly in the vast silence. With a groan of protesting metal, it began to move, slowly at first, then gathering speed, the rhythmic chuff of its engine growing fainter and fainter until it was just a whisper swallowed by the wind. She watched it go, a black scar pulling away across the white landscape, taking with it the last familiar sound, the last link to the world she had left behind. When it was gone, the silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the low, constant moan of the wind sweeping across the plains. She was alone, utterly and completely alone. A knot of cold dread tightened in her stomach, far colder than the wind. She walked the length of the platform, her footsteps the only sound, and peered into the grimy window of the station house. Inside, an old man sat hunched over a telegraph key, a green visor pulled low over his eyes. He didn't look up. He seemed a part of the building itself, as permanent and unmoving as the pot-bellied stove that glowed faintly in the corner. She considered knocking, asking if a message had been left for her, but a stubborn sort of pride held her back. She would not begin her new life by appearing lost and helpless. Mr. Henderson was a rancher, a busy man. Any number of things could have delayed him. A spooked horse, a broken wagon wheel, a sudden squall. She would wait. She chose a spot near the station house, hoping to catch some of the meager warmth radiating from its walls, and set her heavy bag down at her feet. She kept the lamp in her hand, its cold brass a strange comfort. She pulled her coat tighter, the dark wool offering little defense against the persistent, searching wind. It found the gap between her collar and her scarf, the hem of her dress, the thin leather of her boots. Minutes stretched into a quarter of an hour, then a half. The sun sank lower, painting the underside of the clouds in shades of pale rose and bruised purple. The beauty of it was stark and lonely, and it offered no comfort. With the fading light, the cold deepened, becoming more aggressive, more personal. Her feet grew numb, and she began to pace, not out of impatience, but for the simple necessity of warmth. Her path a short, repeated line back and forth on the creaking planks. This was a fool's errand. The thought arrived, unbidden and sharp. She had sold what little she owned, spent the last of her savings on a one-way ticket to a place she'd only seen on a map, all on the strength of a single letter from a man she'd never met. What did she truly know of Lyle Henderson? Only that he ran a horse ranch and needed someone to manage his accounts. What if he had changed his mind? What if he had found someone else, someone local, someone smaller? What if the whole thing had been a cruel jest? She pushed the thoughts away. She had come too far to be undone by doubt now. She had chosen this. She had chosen the honesty of an open sky over the stifling politeness of city parlors. She had chosen the challenge of a ledger book over the slow death of being a maiden aunt in her brother's house, a tall, awkward piece of furniture that was always in the way. She had made her choice, and she would see it through. She focused on the town of Whitestone, what little she could see of it from the station. It was a collection of perhaps 24 buildings huddled along a single, wide, muddy street. False-fronted stores, a hotel, a saloon with swinging doors that seemed to shut tight against the cold. Smoke rose from every chimney, thin white banners of life against the encroaching dusk. It looked hardy, functional, and utterly devoid of welcome. It was a place built for survival, not for comfort. She saw a figure emerge from the general store, a woman bundled in shawls, who cast a brief, incurious glance toward the train station before hurrying on her way. No one else was out. The town was battening down for the night, preparing for the deep, bitter cold that was coming with the darkness. And still, she waited. The sky bled from purple to a deep, starless indigo. The wind grew teeth, biting at her exposed cheeks. Her hope, which had been a steady flame just hours ago, had dwindled to a single, sputtering ember, threatening to be extinguished at any moment. The promise of the letter, of a place where her mind mattered more than her form, seemed to be dissolving into the frozen air. The silence of the platform was no longer just an absence of sound. It felt like a judgment. She clutched the small, cold lamp to her chest. It was empty of oil, its light dormant, but in the growing dark, it felt less like a memory of her mother and more like a symbol of her own foolish, unlit hope. She had carried it all this way, a beacon with no fuel, to a destination where no one was waiting. The cold was inside her now, a deep, aching loneliness that had nothing to do with the temperature. She stood alone on the platform in Whitestone, Wyoming, a tall woman with a worn-out bag and an empty lamp, watching the last of the light die from the sky. The sound, when it came, was not the clear ring of a bell or the call of a human voice, but something more elemental. It was the rhythmic crunch of hooves on frozen earth and the groan of a wagon's axle, a sound that seemed to be born of the landscape itself. Julia stopped her pacing, her body instantly rigid, every nerve ending straining against the cold. She turned her head toward the dark ribbon of road that led from the town, her breath held tight in her chest. A single lantern swung from the side of an approaching buckboard wagon, casting a small, dancing circle of yellow light that bobbed and swayed in the darkness. It was a fragile, solitary beacon in the immense, pressing dark. Inside that circle, she could just make out the shape of a man, his shoulders broad under a heavy sheepskin coat, his hat pulled low against the wind. The wagon was drawn by a pair of sturdy-looking horses, their breath pluming white in the frigid air. For a moment, every doubt, every cold tendril of fear that had wrapped itself around her heart, receded. He had come. He was late. But he had come. A simple explanation would follow a difficult calving, a fence down in the north pasture. She would nod, understanding, and this awful, lonely wait would be forgotten, a mere footnote to the beginning of her new life. She straightened her spine, a subconscious habit, preparing to present the capable, unruffled Miss Arlen he was expecting. The wagon pulled up not to the platform, but to the road that ran alongside it. The man expertly reined in the horses, their harness jingling softly in the sudden quiet. He didn't get down immediately, but sat for a moment, his gaze sweeping the empty platform, a silhouette against the lantern's glow. His eyes passed over her, then passed over her again, his search clearly for someone else. "Hello." His voice was a deep baritone, rough-edged and accustomed to carrying over the sound of wind and livestock. It was not an unkind voice, but it held no particular warmth. It was a voice of function. "Looking for the station master. Train's been and gone." "I see." Julia felt a fresh wave of cold wash over her, a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. He wasn't looking for her. He was looking for a message, perhaps, or a parcel. The carefully constructed hope of the last few minutes began to crumble. She cleared her throat, and the small sound was swallowed by the vastness. She tried again, forcing her voice to be steady, to be louder than she was comfortable with. "Mr. Henderson." The man's head snapped in her direction. He leaned forward slightly, peering into the gloom that lay beyond his lantern's reach. He still couldn't quite make her out, a tall, dark shape against the paler wood of the station house. "I am," he confirmed, his tone guarded. "Who's asking?" "It is I, sir. Julia Arlen. She took a step forward, moving from the shadows into the faint periphery of the light. I arrived on the 3 o'clock train, as per your letter. For a long moment, Lyle Henderson said nothing. He simply stared. Julia could feel his eyes on her. A slow, methodical appraisal that traveled from the scuffed toes of her boots all the way up to the top of her head. It was a look she knew well. The silent measurement, the flicker of disbelief, the swift, internal calculation. But this was different. It wasn't the fleeting curiosity of a stranger on a city street. This was the gaze of the man who held her future in his hands, and his silence was heavy, freighted with a meaning that made her stomach clench. Finally, he swung himself down from the wagon seat. His movements were economical and sure, the motions of a man whose body was a tool he used every day. He was not as tall as she was, though he was powerfully built, with a weathered face and eyes that squinted from long years of staring into the sun and snow. He walked toward the platform, his boots thudding on the hard-packed ground, and stopped at its edge, forcing her to look down at him. The position felt immediately wrong, a reversal of the natural order of things as he understood them. "Miss Arlen," he said, and the name sounded foreign on his tongue, as if he were trying it on for size and finding it didn't fit. He looked up at her face, then his gaze dropped to the worn satchel at her feet, and finally, back up again. "I had imagined you smaller." The words were spoken plainly, a simple statement of fact, yet they landed with the force of a physical blow. There it was, the single immutable fact of her existence that always, eventually, overshadowed everything else. Her mind, her skills with a ledger, her quiet dependability, all of it erased by the simple mathematics of her height. She felt the familiar, hot sting of shame behind her eyes. But her years of practice held. She would not flinch. She would not apologize for the space she occupied in the world. "I am as God made me, Mr. Henderson," she replied, her voice level, betraying none of the chaos that had just been unleashed inside her. Her heart, which had been a slow, frozen drum, was now hammering against her ribs, a frantic, trapped thing. He seemed to take no notice of her composure. He was still processing, his brow furrowed in thought. A fence went down by the north ridge. He said the words an automatic, belated explanation for his lateness. "Took 2 of my best hands and me the better part of the afternoon to mend it in this wind. Lost astray." He spoke as if to himself, his mind clearly on the practical problems of his ranch, of which he had just, jarringly, become one. He looked up at her again, and this time, the appraisal was finished. A decision had been made. "This won't do," he said. The words were not cruel, merely final. They were delivered with the same frank, unemotional tone he might have used to declare a horse lame or a well gone dry. Julia's hands, hidden in her thin gloves, clenched into fists. "Sir," she managed to ask, though her throat felt tight and raw. "I don't understand. My qualifications are impeccable. Mr. Abernathy in Chicago can vouch for my skill." "Your qualifications are on paper, Miss Arlen," he interrupted, waving a dismissive hand. "This is Wyoming. Things are different out here. The job, it ain't just sitting at a desk with a pen. This is a working ranch. The bookkeeper. They ride out to the camps with the payroll. They deal with the hands directly. Men who aren't always polite. They need to be able to move with the work, to be a part of it." He paused, searching for the right words, his gaze frank and unapologetic. "It requires a certain image. A woman on a horse, bringing the wages folks expect her to be, well," he gestured vaguely with his hand, a gesture that encompassed everything she was not. "It's a matter of practicality. You just don't fit the picture of it." The picture, she was not a person, with skills and hopes and a desperate need for this position. She was an element in a composition, and she was the wrong size, the wrong shape. The careful logic she had built her life around that competence should be enough. that her mind could overcome the shell it was housed in, shattered here, in this vast, open country that she had hoped would be free of such petty judgments. The rules were even more rigid, the picture even more narrowly defined. The carefully constructed dam of her composure finally broke. She could feel the blood drain from her face, and for a terrifying second, the platform seemed to tilt beneath her feet. The swinging lantern on his wagon blurred, its light swimming before her eyes. "So you are dismissing me?" she asked, and the words came out as a whisper, stripped of their earlier resolve. "You are dismissing me because I am tall." He had the decency to look uncomfortable then. For the first time, he shifted his weight from one foot to the other and took his hat off, running a hand through his hair. "Now, I wouldn't put it so plainly as that," he began, though that was precisely how he had put it. "It's about what works, what fits, and this just doesn't fit. It would cause talk. It would be awkward. For you, and for me." He was trying to soften the blow, she realized, but the attempt only made it worse. He was casting his prejudice as a kindness to her, a way of saving her from the awkwardness of her own existence. He reached into the pocket of his heavy coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. He loosened the drawstring and tipped a few coins into his palm. He held them out to her. "Here," he said, his voice dropping into a businesslike tone, clearly relieved to be moving on to the practicalities of the dismissal. "This is for your time and your trouble. For the ticket, there's a hotel in town, the Drover's Rest. You can get a room for the night. The eastbound train comes through at 7 in the morning. It'll take you as far as Cheyenne. From there, you can get back to wherever you came from." Julia stared at the coins glinting in his palm. It was an insult, a cold, metallic dismissal of everything she was and everything she had hoped to be. It was payment rendered not for a service, but for an inconvenience. Taking it felt like an admission of her own unsuitability, an acceptance of his judgment, but not taking it. What choice did she have? She was 1,000 miles from anyone she knew, with less than $1 to her name. Slowly, numbly, she reached out her hand. Her gloved fingers felt clumsy and foreign as she accepted the coins. They were cold and heavy, a dead weight in her palm. "I'm sorry for it, Miss Arlen," he said, and she thought he might actually mean it. In his own limited way, he was sorry for the inconvenience, for the untidiness of it all. It was a long way to come for nothing, but it's for the best. He put his hat back on, a gesture of finality. He turned and walked back to his wagon without another word, without a backward glance. He swung himself up into the driver's seat, picked up the reins, and with a soft cluck to his horses, turned the wagon around and headed back toward the town. Julia stood motionless on the platform, the coins clutched in her fist. She watched the single and swinging lantern recede into the darkness, its small, hopeful light shrinking until it was just a pinprick. And then nothing at all. He was gone. The wind howled around her, no longer just a sound, but a living, malevolent thing, tearing at her clothes, seeking out her skin, but she barely felt it. The cold that gripped her now was a different creature entirely. It radiated from the coins in her hand, a profound, soul-deep chill that settled in her bones. It was the cold of a door slammed shut, of a future erased. It was the absolute, crystalline cold of a rejection delivered by a man who had looked at her for less than 5 minutes and decided she was not worth the trouble. It was a coldness that no fire could ever hope to warm. She did not walk to the Drover's Rest. To do so felt like a final, pathetic surrender, an obedience to the man who had just excised her from his world. The coins in her fist were a brand, and to spend them on the bed he had prescribed for her felt like pressing the hot iron to her own skin. So she walked, but her feet carried her away from the single, muddy street and its huddled buildings. She followed the road out of town for a short distance, until it was just a pair of dark ruts in the snow, and then she veered off, her boots sinking into the untouched powder. She found herself climbing a low, wind-swept hill that overlooked the sparse lights of Whitestone. It wasn't much of a climb, just a gentle rise in the land, but it was enough to put the town at a distance, to turn it into a collection of insignificant glowing squares against the vast, indifferent darkness. Here, the wind was a constant presence, a physical force that pushed against her, whispering of an immense and terrifying emptiness. She found a place where a cluster of dark, skeletal bushes broke the wind's full force and sank to the frozen ground. She set the leather satchel beside her, a solid, useless weight. In her lap, she held the brass lamp. The cold of the metal seeped through her woolen gloves, through her dress, a small, concentrated point of cold that mirrored the larger one blooming in her chest. She sat for a long time, watching the lights of the town. She saw a door open and close, spilling a brief, rowdy slash of yellow light onto the snow. She heard the faint, far-off whinny of a horse, each small sign of life, of warmth and purpose, only served to deepen the chasm of her own isolation. The moon had risen, a sliver of bone-white ice in a sky littered with stars that looked like chips of frozen glass. It offered no warmth, only a stark, unforgiving light that bleached the snow and sharpened the shadows. In this cold, clear light, her situation was laid bare, stripped of any remaining pretense of hope. She was a stranger in a strange land, with no job, no prospects, and a handful of coins that felt like charity from a man who had judged her unworthy on sight. "I had imagined you, smaller." The words echoed in the silence, more cutting than the wind. It was the story of her life, a story she had traveled a continent to escape, only to find it waiting for her, etched into the very landscape. All her life, she had tried to compensate. She had been quieter, more diligent, more studious than anyone else. She had honed her mind into a sharp, precise instrument, hoping its brilliance would blind people to the inconvenient size of the vessel that housed it. But it never worked. In the end, they only ever saw the vessel. A wave of despair so profound it felt like drowning washed over her. It was a cold, quiet, numbing thing. What was she to do now? Wait for the 7 o'clock train, as instructed. Crawl back to Boston, back to her brother's house, a failure in a new and more spectacular fashion. The thought was unbearable. She would rather freeze to death on this desolate Wyoming hill than face the pitying looks. The "I told you so" whispered behind cupped hands. Her fingers tightened on the lamp. It was empty. She had been so careful with it on the journey, wrapping it in her spare shawl, ensuring it wasn't jostled. She had planned to buy oil for it in Whitestone, to light it in her own small room on the Triple Divide Ranch. It was to be her hearth, the first light in her new life. Now, it was just a piece of cold, hollow brass, a monument to a foolish dream. A bitter impulse seized her. She could leave it here, just set it down in the snow and walk away, abandon this last, useless link to a past that had no bearing on this brutal present. She drew her arm back, the muscles in her shoulder tight and cold, ready to cast the thing away into the darkness. "It's not so easy to be forgotten." The voice came from the shadows, so quiet and unexpected that for a moment she thought she had imagined it, that it was just a strange trick of the wind whistling through the brush. It was a man's voice, low and calm, with a rough, gravelly texture to it, like stones rolling in a slow river. It held no alarm, no judgment, just a simple, observant quality. Julia froze, her arm still half raised. Her heart, which had been beating in a slow, painful rhythm, gave a single, violent lurch. She was not alone. She slowly lowered her arm, pulling the lamp back into her lap as if to shield herself with it. She peered into the darkness beyond her small sanctuary of bushes. A figure detached itself from the deeper shadow of a lone, stunted pine tree a dozen yards away. He moved with a slow, deliberate ease, his footsteps making almost no sound in the snow. He was not a large man, not in the way Lyle Henderson had been, all broad shoulders and solid presence. This man was leaner, taller than Henderson, but not as tall as she was, with a lanky, rangy build that spoke of endurance rather than brute strength. As he stepped into the pale moonlight, she could see he wore worn denim trousers, a sheepskin-lined jacket, and a battered hat that sat low on his brow, shadowing his face. He stopped a respectful distance away, not wanting to crowd her. He didn't look at her with the startled, appraising stare she was so used to. His gaze was steady, his eyes accustomed to the dark. "Saw Henderson's wagon come and go," the man said, his voice still quiet. "He hooked his thumbs into his belt. Saw you were still here. Figured you might not be." Julia said nothing. Her throat was tight with a mixture of fear and a fierce, protective pride. Who was this man? What did he want? Had he been watching her this whole time? A silent witness to her humiliation. "Name's Elias Boone," he offered, as if sensing her questions. "I work a spread north of here. Saw you on the platform when I rode past. Henderson's a man who likes his world to be square. You're a circle. He doesn't know what to do with circles." The simple, unexpected metaphor struck her with more force than an expression of pity ever could. He wasn't just observing. He understood. He had distilled the entire excruciating encounter into a single, elegant truth. Still, she remained silent, her distrust a cold, hard shell around her. In her experience, nothing came without a price, especially not kindness from a strange man in the dark. Elias Boone seemed untroubled by her silence. He looked up at the frozen stars, then back down at the town. "That eastbound train ain't a pleasant ride, especially not when you ain't planning on it." He paused. "There's a place in town, a boarding house, run by a woman named May Dunning. She's got a warm stove and strong coffee, and she doesn't ask too many questions. Collects strays. Old May does. Lost kittens, lame dogs, people who get left on the platform. She'd have a room for you." The offer hung in the air between them. It was a lifeline, a simple, practical solution to her immediate, overwhelming problem. A warm room, a place to think that wasn't a windswept hill, but to accept it meant placing her trust in this complete stranger, a man who had materialized out of the night. Her brief, disastrous encounter with Lyle Henderson had scoured away any faith she might have had in the intentions of others. Henderson's letter had been a promise, and it had turned to ash. What was this man's quiet offer but another potential betrayal? "Why would you help me?" she asked, her voice raspy from the cold and disuse. "You don't know me." Elias considered the question for a moment. His head tilted slightly. "No, ma'am, I don't," he admitted. "But I know Henderson, and I know what it's like to be on the wrong side of a slammed door. Seemed like you could use a better option than freezing out here or taking his coin to the hotel he picked for you." He saw it all. He saw the pride that kept her from the Drover's Rest, the despair that had driven her up this hill. He saw her, and in that moment, for the first time that day, she felt like a person again. Not just a problem to be solved or an ill-fitting shape. Yet the fear, the ingrained habit of caution, was stronger. "I don't trust anyone," she said, and the words were a confession, the bleak, central truth of her life at that moment. Elias Boone nodded slowly, as if this were the most reasonable statement in the world. He didn't argue. He didn't try to persuade her of his own good character. He looked at her, his gaze direct in the moonlight, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something in his shadowed eyes, not pity, but a deep, quiet understanding. "Well," he said, his voice soft but clear against the wind, "then start by trusting yourself." He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was half salute, half farewell. He turned to leave. His part said, the choice left entirely, unequivocally, to her. He was not a savior. He was a signpost, pointing to a different road. Julia watched him take 2 steps back toward the shadows, Her mind raced. She could stay here. She could cling to her pride and her distrust and let the cold do its work. Or she could take a chance. Not on him, necessarily, but on the possibility that he was right. She could trust her own judgment. And her judgment, her screaming, shivering body, told her that survival was more important than pride. "Wait," she called out, the word small but sharp in the night air. Elias stopped and turned back, waiting patiently. Slowly, her limbs stiff and aching. Julia got to her feet. She brushed the snow from her dress, her movements awkward. She picked up her heavy satchel, the symbol of her failed journey, and cradled the empty lamp in her other arm. She took a deep, shuddering breath of the icy air and looked at the man waiting in the moonlight. She gave a single, curt nod. It was all the answer he needed. Without another word, he turned and began to walk down the hill toward the lights of Whitestone, and she, after a moment's hesitation, followed. They walked in silence, two solitary figures moving through the cold, luminous dark, leaving the lonely hill behind them. The door to May Dunning's boarding house opened not into a formal entryway, but directly into the heart of the home, a large, warm kitchen. The change was so abrupt, so absolute, that Julia felt a sense of physical shock, as if she had stepped from one world into another. Outside, the world was a study in black and white, a place of sharp, biting wind and profound, empty silence. Inside was a world of amber light and muted colors, a sanctuary of warmth that smelled of brewing coffee, wood smoke, and the rich, savory scent of baking cornbread. A large cast-iron stove dominated one wall, its surface glowing with a dull red heat that radiated through the room like a benevolent presence. A long wooden table, scrubbed pale from years of use, sat in the center of the room, surrounded by a collection of mismatched chairs. The air was thick with a comfortable humidity from a kettle steaming on the stove. This was not just a room. It was a refuge. A woman stood at a flour-dusted counter, her back to the door. She was broad-shouldered and wore a simple calico dress with an apron tied around her ample waist. Her graying hair was pinned up in a practical, no-nonsense bun. She didn't turn at the sound of the door opening, only spoke over her shoulder, her voice a low, pleasant alto. "Wipe your feet, Elias Boone, and don't you be tracking half of Wyoming onto my clean floor." "Evening, May." Elias's quiet voice sounded different in the enclosed space. Softer. "I've brought you someone." The woman, May Dunning, finally turned. She wiped her hands on her apron, and her eyes, a clear and intelligent gray, moved from Elias to Julia. She took in the entire picture in a single, swift glance: Julia's height, the fine but worn wool of her city coat, the exhausted pallor of her face, the raw-boned look of someone who had been scoured by wind and sorrow, and the stubborn, straight line of her spine. Her gaze was not judgmental, nor was it pitying. It was simply observant. The look of a woman who knew how to read people the way she knew how to read the weather. "So I see," May said. Her eyes flickered back to Elias for a brief moment, and an entire conversation seemed to pass between them in that silent look. Then she turned her full attention back to Julia. "Well, don't just stand there letting the cold in. Come on, girl. Sit by the fire. You look half frozen." Elias gave Julia a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent transfer of trust. "I'll leave her with you, then, May, gotta get back to the camp." "You'll have a cup of coffee before you face that wind again," May stated. It wasn't a question. She moved to the stove, her steps heavy but sure, and picked up a blue enamel coffee pot. "No time tonight," Elias said, already backing toward the door. "Thanks all the same." He touched the brim of his hat toward Julia, a gesture so brief she almost missed it. "Ma'am." And then he was gone, the door closing with a soft click, leaving Julia alone with this strange woman in this warm, fragrant room. The silence that followed was not awkward. May moved with a quiet efficiency that left no room for it. She took a thick ceramic mug from a shelf, filled it with steaming black coffee, and set it on the table. Then she used a cloth to open the oven door, releasing a fresh wave of warmth and the mouth-watering smell of cornbread. She cut a thick golden slab from the loaf in the pan and placed it on a plate next to the mug. "Sit," she said again, gesturing with the knife toward a chair near the stove. Numbly, Julia did as she was told. She shed her coat, letting it fall onto an empty chair, and sat down. She wrapped her cold, gloved hands around the warm mug, the heat a shocking, almost painful pleasure against her frozen skin. She felt clumsy and out of place, a great, tall crane that had somehow wandered into a cozy henhouse. May sat down opposite her, her gaze steady. "Elias is a good man. Doesn't say much, but he sees things. Said you had a disagreement with Lyle Henderson." Julia could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. She took a sip of the coffee. It was strong and scalding hot, and it felt like it was melting a column of ice that had been lodged in her chest. "That's Lyle for you," May said with a sigh, as if discussing a predictable but trying neighbor. "Likes his fences straight and his accounts tidy, and his women no taller than his shoulder. A man can get set in his ideas out here. Doesn't leave much room for anything that don't fit the pattern." She pushed the plate of cornbread closer to Julia. "Eat. You can't face the world on an empty stomach." Julia picked up the cornbread. It was still warm. The butter May had slathered on it melting into the crumb. She took a bite, and the simple, honest flavor of it salty, sweet, substantial was so overwhelmingly good that it almost brought tears to her eyes. It was the first truly kind thing that had happened to her all day, a kindness she could taste and feel. She ate the entire piece, then another that May cut for her, and drank the hot coffee. And with every bite, with every sip, she could feel a slow, gentle thawing begin deep inside her. The hard, brittle shell of despair that had encased her began to soften at the edges. They didn't talk much more that evening. May seemed to understand that what Julia needed was not conversation, but a quiet, undemanding warmth. After she had eaten, May showed her to a small, clean room upstairs. It contained a narrow bed with a thick quilt, a washstand with a basin and pitcher, and a single window that looked out over the dark, sleeping town. It was plain, but it was a haven. Julia lay down on the bed, still fully clothed, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, the first she had known in what felt like a lifetime. She woke late the next morning to the smell of frying bacon. For a moment, she was disoriented, the unfamiliar room a stark contrast to the jolting, clattering world of the train car she had inhabited for so long. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back the empty platform. Henderson's blunt rejection, the endless, cold wait. But this time, the memory was followed by the scent of bacon, the feeling of the thick quilt, the knowledge of the warm kitchen downstairs. The despair was still there, a dull ache in her chest, but it was no longer all-consuming. She washed her face with the cold water from the pitcher and went downstairs. May was there, of course, along with two rough-looking men in dusty clothes who were quietly eating breakfast. They nodded at Julia as she entered, their gazes curious but not unfriendly, and then went back to their food. May simply pointed to the coffee pot on the stove and the skillet of bacon on the table. Julia served herself and sat, feeling less like an intruder and more like a quiet part of the morning's routine. She knew she couldn't accept May's charity for long. The coins from Henderson were a bitter weight in her pocket, enough for a few days' room and board and a ticket to nowhere. As she was finishing her breakfast, a woman from the town came in, a young son of about 7 or 8 trailing behind her. The boy had a long, gaping tear in the sleeve of his winter shirt. "Morning, May," the woman said, her voice weary. "I swear, this boy, he thinks he's a wildcat, climbing trees he has no business in. I haven't the time to fix this today, and my sewing is all thumbs to begin with." May clicked her tongue. "Let me see it. Martha, Lord, child, you've made a mess of it." Julia watched them, and without thinking, she spoke up. "I could mend it, if you like." Both women turned to look at her. Martha looked skeptical. "You, miss?" "I am quite skilled with a needle," Julia said quietly. It was one of the few accomplishments she possessed that had never been a source of shame or awkwardness. It would be no trouble. May looked at Julia, a slow smile spreading across her face. "There you are, Martha. Providence. Let the lady see to it." She went to a drawer and produced a small sewing kit. Julia took the shirt. The tear was jagged, but the fabric was a sturdy wool. She sat in a rocking chair by the window where the light was best and went to work. Her fingers, long and nimble, moved with a practiced grace. She trimmed the frayed edges, folded the seam, and began to stitch, her needle flying in and out of the fabric in a series of tiny, perfect, nearly invisible stitches. It was quiet, methodical work, and she lost herself in it. For those 15 minutes, she was not the tall, rejected woman from the city. She was a person with a skill, a person creating order out of a small chaos. When she was finished, the tear was gone. In its place was a flat, strong seam that would hold against the efforts of any aspiring wildcat. She handed the shirt back to the boy's mother. Martha stared at the seam, her eyes wide with astonishment. "Well, I'll be—" she breathed. "I've never seen such fine work. It's better than it was new." She looked up at Julia, her expression transformed from skepticism to genuine admiration. "Thank you, Miss. Truly." A faint warmth bloomed in Julia's chest. A feeling so unfamiliar she almost didn't recognize it. It was the warmth of being useful. Later that afternoon, as she was helping May clear the dishes from the midday meal, Julia noticed the kitchen curtain. It was a simple muslin curtain, yellowed with age and steam, and the hem on one side had come completely undone, leaving a long, trailing string and a crooked edge. "I could fix that for you as well, Mrs. Dunning," Julia offered. "Call me May," the older woman corrected her. "And are you sure, child, you're meant to be resting?" "I would like to," Julia insisted. "It's better to have my hands busy." May gave her that knowing look again and fetched the curtain. Julia spent the next hour carefully restitching the entire hem, her stitches as neat and even as the columns in a ledger. As she worked, she felt as if she were mending something within herself, pulling the frayed edges of her own life back into a semblance of order. When she hung the curtain back in its place, it fell in a straight, clean line. The kitchen, which had already felt so welcoming, now seemed a little brighter, a little more complete. She didn't know it, but these two small acts, the mending of a shirt and the hemming of a curtain, were ripples spreading out across the small pond of Whitestone. Martha went to the general store to buy thread and told the proprietor, Mr. Gable, about the tall, quiet woman at May's boarding house who sewed like an artist. May mentioned to the man who delivered her firewood how the city woman had fixed her curtain without being asked, and how she had a quiet, dignified way about her. Elias Boone had already told a few of the other hands at his camp about the bookkeeper Henderson had turned away, and how she hadn't cried or pleaded but had just stood there on the platform, straight as a pine tree. The stories began to weave together, passed in quiet conversations over store counters and across saloon tables. A picture of Julia Arlen began to form in the town's collective mind, a picture painted by others. They spoke of a woman from the city, which made her an object of curiosity. They spoke of her skill with a needle, a practical and respected talent. They mentioned she was a bookkeeper by trade, a skill that was rare and valuable. And woven through all of it was the one undeniable fact of her appearance. But here, in the retelling, it was no longer a flaw. It became a descriptor, a part of her strength. The rumor that took root in the frozen ground of Whitestone was this: there was a woman at May Dunning's, a city woman who could sew and cipher, who stood nearly 6 feet tall and didn't apologize for it to anyone. 4 days passed. The eastbound train came and went 4 times. its lonely whistle a mournful cry in the frozen morning air. With each passing, Julia felt a small, secret victory. She had not been on it, she had stayed. Her life at May Dunning's boarding house fell into a quiet, simple rhythm, a routine as steady and comforting as the slow ticking of the mantel clock in the main room. She rose early, helped May with the breakfast for the few boarders, and then found ways to make herself useful. She had a mind that craved order, a talent that had, until now, been confined to the neat columns of a ledger. Here, she applied that talent to the small, domestic world of the boarding house. She organized May's pantry, arranging tins and sacks into a logical system that the older woman, more a creature of instinct than of order, marveled at. She took an inventory of the house linens, mending worn sheets and darning threadbare socks with a precision that was almost reverent. She spent an entire afternoon with a bucket of hot water and lye soap, scrubbing the kitchen floor until the pale wood gleamed. These were small, simple tasks, but for Julia, they were a kind of salvation. Each mended seam, each tidy shelf, was a small piece of a broken world set right. She worked not to earn her keep, though she knew she was doing so, but for the simple, profound satisfaction of the work itself. Her hands were always busy, and when her hands were busy, her mind had less room to dwell on the echoing emptiness of Lyle Henderson's rejection. She spoke little, but she watched and she listened. She learned the rhythms of the house and of the town. She learned that the boarder in the corner room was a trapper who came to town once a month, his silence as deep and vast as the wilderness he inhabited. She learned that the two men who ate breakfast before dawn worked for the railroad, their talk a constant, weary litany of frozen switches and delayed freight. And she learned more about May Dunning, a woman whose gruff exterior concealed a reservoir of quiet, practical compassion. May never asked Julia about her past or her future. She simply kept her coffee mug full and made sure she ate, an acceptance more profound than any words of comfort could have been. On the evening of the fourth day, as a thick stew bubbled on the stove, perfuming the kitchen with the scent of beef and root vegetables, the door opened. It was Elias Boone. He entered as he had first appeared, quietly, without ceremony. He took off his hat as he stepped inside, revealing a head of dark, unruly hair, and stamped the snow from his boots with a methodical thoroughness that May clearly appreciated. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, found Julia where she sat at the table, a basket of mending in her lap. He gave her a brief nod, a simple acknowledgement of her presence, before turning his attention to May. "Evening, May. That stew smells good enough to bring a man in from 10 miles out." "It'll be another hour yet," May said, stirring the pot with a large wooden spoon. "But the coffee's hot. You look like you could use some." This time, he didn't refuse. I believe I could at that. He walked over to the table and pulled out a chair, not directly opposite Julia, but at the corner, a placement that felt respectful of her space. He was dressed, as before, for the cold and for work, but seeing him in the warm lamplight, she noticed things she hadn't seen in the stark moonlight on the hill. There were fine lines around his eyes, etched there by sun and wind. His hands, as he accepted the mug of coffee from May, were lean and calloused, the knuckles scraped, the hands of a man who worked with horses and ropes and the unforgiving materials of the land. He held himself with a kind of contained stillness, a stark contrast to Henderson's assertive, space-filling presence. May sat down with them, and for a few minutes, the conversation was a slow, meandering thing, the talk of people who understood the weight of silence. They spoke of the weather, of the price of feed, of a mare at a neighboring ranch that had thrown a fine-looking colt. Through it all, Julia kept her head bent over her sewing, her needle moving in a steady rhythm. She was a quiet observer on the edge of their world, and she was content with that. But she could feel Elias Boone's gaze on her from time to time. Not a stare, but a quiet, contemplative look, Finally, after draining his coffee mug, he set it down on the table with a soft click. He turned his attention fully to Julia. "Miss Arlen," he said, his voice low and direct, "May tells me you've been making yourself useful." Julia looked up from her mending, startled to be addressed so directly. "I've been happy to help Mrs. Dunning," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "It's May," the older woman corrected her automatically, before getting up to fetch the coffee pot. Elias paid the interruption no mind. He leaned forward slightly, his forearms resting on the table. "I came to town for supplies," he said, "but I was also hoping I might have a word with you. About work." Julia's hands stilled in her lap. The needle, poised in the fabric, suddenly felt very heavy. She looked at him, her expression guarded. She had allowed a fragile sort of peace to settle over her in this house, and the word work felt like a stone tossed into a still pool. "As you may have gathered," she said, her voice gaining a bit of its formal stiffness, "my last attempt to secure a position was not successful." "I'm not Lyle Henderson," Elias said simply. The statement was not a boast, but a plain fact, and it immediately cleared the air of the ghost that had been lingering between them. "I don't own the spread I work on. I'm the foreman for a man back east who wouldn't know a horse's head from its tail. He owns the land and the stock, me and the boys. We do the work." He took a slow breath, gathering his thoughts. He was not a man who spoke easily, and she could see the effort it took for him to lay out his situation. "The thing is," he continued, "the old foreman, he kept the books, such as they were. He was a good man with a horse, but not so good with a pen. He'd keep track of supplies, wages, feed orders, mostly in his head, with a few notes scrawled on the back of a feed bill. He took off for California 2 months back, and I find myself with a real mess on my hands." He painted a picture for her, his words simple and direct. He spoke of ledgers where the ink was smeared and the columns didn't add up. He spoke of a storeroom full of supplies with no clear inventory, of sacks of flour and barrels of salt pork ordered twice over, while they were running short on coffee and horseshoes. He spoke of the approach of winter, the real, deep winter that had not yet set in, and the gnawing uncertainty of not knowing if they had enough hay to last until the spring thaw, or if he was paying a hand who only existed on paper. "I can break a colt," Elias said, looking down at his calloused hands. "I can track a stray in a blizzard, and I can mend a fence in a gale. But I look at those books, at that pile of receipts and bills, and it's like a foreign language. I'm wasting money we don't have, and I'm liable to run us short on something we desperately need before the snows get too deep to get a wagon through." He finally looked up, and his gaze was steady and serious. "I need someone to make sense of it, to take that mess and turn it into something I can understand, to figure out what we have, what we owe, and what we need." He stopped, letting his proposition settle in the warm, quiet air of the kitchen. Julia's heart was beating a slow, heavy rhythm. This was not the offer Lyle Henderson had made. Henderson had been hiring for a position, a title, a picture. Elias Boone was asking for help. He was not offering a job so much as presenting a problem, a tangled knot that he needed a specific kind of mind to unravel. "Why me?" she asked. The question a genuine one. There must be others. Men in the town. "Mr. Gable at the store can add a column of figures." "Sure," Elias admitted. "But he's got his own business to run. The men I work with, they're like me. Good with their hands. Not so good with a pen. What I need is someone who can look at the whole mess and see a pattern. Someone who can build a system. You were hired by Henderson because someone in Chicago, someone who knows about these things, said you were the best they knew. Henderson might not have valued that. I do." He paused, and his next words were what changed everything. He looked at her, and his eyes held no trace of the assessment she had come to expect. No calculation of her size or her strangeness. He just saw her, the woman who had been left on the platform and had not broken. "I don't need someone gentle." "Miss Arlen," he said, his voice dropping a little lower, a little rougher with sincerity. "I don't need someone to pour tea and make polite conversation. The camps are rough, the work is hard. What I need is someone who won't leave." And there it was, the moment she had been waiting for her entire life, though she had never known it. It was the first time that her most defining act in this new, harsh land, the simple, stubborn act of staying, had been named as a virtue. Henderson had seen her height and judged her unfit. Elias had seen her resilience and judged her essential. It was the first time a man had looked at her, truly looked, and seen not her size, but her substance. A wave of emotion so powerful it almost stole her breath washed over her. It wasn't relief, not exactly. It was a feeling of profound, earth-shattering validation. He was not offering a position to be filled. He was asking for her help. He was not judging her appearance. He was valuing her character. She looked down at her own hands, resting on the half-mended shirt in her lap. They were capable hands. She looked up at the neatly hemmed curtain hanging by the window. She had created order there. She could do the same for him. For the first time since she'd stepped off that train, she felt a flicker, not of the blind hope she had arrived with, but of a quiet, solid confidence in her own ability. She folded the fabric in her lap with a deliberate, final motion and set the mending basket on the floor beside her chair. She looked Elias Boone directly in the eye. "Yes," she said. The word was not loud, but it filled the kitchen. "I will help you." It was not because she needed the work, though she did. It was not because she was desperate, though a part of her still was. It was because, for the first time in her 28 years, she had been asked to be exactly who she was. The work began not with a grand gesture, but with the quiet, thudding sound of a wooden crate being placed on May Dunning's kitchen floor. Elias Boone brought the first of the ledgers and a chaotic collection of receipts stuffed into burlap sacks 2 days after their agreement. He did not stay long, seemed almost anxious to leave the unruly mess in her hands. As if it were a wild animal he was relieved to have caged. "It's all there," he'd said, gesturing to the pile, or what's left of it. "Do what you can." And so, Julia began. May cleared a small table for her in a corner of the main room, near a window that caught the pale afternoon light. It became her territory, a small island of order in the comfortable, lived-in clutter of the boarding house. She laid out the books, the stacks of paper, a fresh bottle of ink, and her own set of sharp-nibbed pens that she had carefully protected on her journey. And she plunged into the chaos of the North Slope Ranch. It was, as Elias had promised, a formidable mess. The previous foreman had used a system known only to himself, a bewildering mix of shorthand, memory, and pure guesswork. Entries were scrawled in pencil, then written over in ink. Receipts for hay were stuffed inside a ledger for household goods. There were bills for saddles that had been paid twice and wages recorded for men who, as far as she could tell from other entries, had left the ranch months ago. It was an archaeological dig into a year of mismanagement and benign neglect. Yet, Julia found a strange satisfaction in it. The work was a puzzle, a complex knot waiting for patient fingers. She worked slowly, methodically, her long fingers flying across the pages, creating new ledgers, her script a model of clarity and precision. She cross-referenced bills with delivery notes, built inventories from scribbled lists, and began to impose a clean, logical structure onto the chaos, with every balanced column, with every verified expense. She felt a piece of her own disordered world click back into place. Elias came to town every few days, his visits becoming a quiet feature of her new life. He would bring another sack of papers, another half-forgotten ledger he'd found in the tack room. He would stand by her table, smelling of pine and horse and the cold outdoor air, and watch her work. He rarely spoke, but his presence was a steady, grounding thing. Sometimes she would have questions for him, and their conversations were always brief, practical, and to the point. "Who is C. Mulligan?" she asked one afternoon. tapping a finger on a smudged entry. He's been drawing wages for 6 months, but there are no receipts for supplies under his name. Elias squinted at the page. Caleb Mulligan. He's one of the line riders. Lives in the far camp, feeds himself mostly. A good hand. Quiet. And this charge for general hardware from the smithy. That would be for the new shoes on the 2 pack mules and a set of hinges for the corral gate. He answered without hesitation. She began to see the ranch through the abstract lens of its finances, and he, through his terse explanations, gave it life and color. She learned the names of the horses, the layout of the camps, the personalities of the men, all through the dry language of numbers and goods. A deep, unspoken respect grew between them in that quiet corner of May's boarding house. He respected the sharp, orderly power of her mind, her ability to see the whole intricate picture where he only saw a confusing jumble of parts. And she, in turn, respected his deep, practical knowledge, his intimate understanding of the men and the land he managed. He never complimented her work directly, but she saw his appreciation in the way the tension in his shoulders eased when she showed him a balanced payroll sheet, in the quiet relief in his eyes when she presented him with a coherent inventory of their winter supplies. They were 2 people who spoke different languages, yet in the shared task of bringing order to his world, they were beginning to understand one another perfectly. A gentle, hesitant awareness grew in the spaces between their words. It was in the way he started bringing her a small, hot meat pie from the town bakery when he came, setting it on the edge of her desk without a word. It was in the way she began to save her most complex questions for the end of the day, knowing his arrival would be a welcome interruption. It was a fragile, unacknowledged thing, as delicate as the first thin sheet of ice on a pond. One evening, about 3 weeks after she had started the work, a fierce wind rose up out of the north. It was not the steady, sighing wind she had grown accustomed to, but a wild, angry thing that tore at the house with unseen claws. It rattled the window panes in their frames and moaned in the chimney, a sound of profound, elemental loneliness. The boarders stayed close to the fire, their voices low, as if not to challenge the storm. Julia worked late at her table, the flickering lamplight making the shadows dance. She was nearing the end of her task. The chaos had been tamed. The ledgers were clean, the inventories complete. What was left was the final summary, the clear, concise report that would give Elias the tool he needed to run his ranch properly. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear the door open over the howl of the wind. She only knew he was there when a gust of frigid air washed over her, and she looked up to see him closing the door behind him, shaking the snow from his hat. He looked different tonight. He was not just cold. He was weary, the kind of deep weariness that settles into a man's bones. His jacket was damp, and his hands, she noticed, were raw and scraped, smeared with the dark, sticky resin of pine and streaks of half-frozen mud. He didn't have any papers with him.
"Elias,"
May said from her chair by the fire.
"it's a terrible night to be out. A tree down on the North Trail."
2 of them, he said, his voice rough with fatigue. Took most of the day to clear a path for the supply wagon. Had to be done. His eyes found Julia's across the room. He gave her a tired nod, then walked not to her work table, but toward the staircase. He was carrying something. It was only when he stepped into the fuller light of the main lamp that she saw what it was. A new oil lamp. It was simple and sturdy, made of dark, burnished tin with a clean, clear glass chimney. He came over to her table and set it down carefully beside her inkwell. The scent of pine and cold earth clung to it. "Your lamp was dry," he said, his voice low. "Meant only for her." He gestured with his head toward the stairs, toward her room where her own small, empty brass lamp sat on the washstand. May must have told him about it. "The store was about to close. I got you some oil, too." He placed a small canister of kerosene next to the lamp. Julia stared at the object. It was such a simple thing, a lamp, a practical, necessary item. but in the warm, quiet room, with the wind screaming outside. It felt like something else entirely. It felt like a profound gesture, a statement he could not have put into words. He looked at her, his gaze direct and serious. "Don't let it go out," he said. The words were simple, yet they landed in her heart with an incredible weight. He was not just talking about a lamp. He was talking about the faint, flickering light she had rekindled within herself here, in this house. He was telling her to protect it. She looked from the lamp to his face, and then down at his hands, chapped and dirty from a long day of hard labor. He had cleared a path through a storm, and at the end of it, his thought had been of her empty lamp. A question rose in her, a question that came from a place of deep, guarded vulnerability, from a lifetime of being overlooked and misjudged. Why, she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why are you helping me?" Elias. He seemed taken aback by the question, as if the answer were the most obvious thing in the world. He looked away for a moment, toward the fire, gathering his thoughts. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the flames and the howling of the wind. When he finally looked back at her, his eyes were clear and startlingly honest. "When Henderson left you on that platform," he began, his voice slow and deliberate, "I watched from the road. I figured you'd be on that morning train. Anyone would have been. It's what people do. They get pushed, they run, they find an easier road." He paused, and his gaze was so intense it felt as if he were seeing right through her, into the core of her loneliness and her pride. "But you didn't," he said. "You stayed. You walked up that hill in the dark and you faced it down. And you've been here every day since, not asking for a thing, just quietly making a place for yourself. In this world, Miss Arlen, most things can be bought or broken, but a person who stays, a person who doesn't run when it gets hard, that's a rare thing. I'm not helping you. I'm just trying to keep a rare thing from being lost." He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then, as if embarrassed by his own eloquence, he straightened up. "Get some rest," he said, his voice back to its usual rough timbre. He gave a final nod, turned, and walked out of the boarding house, back into the wind and the night. Julia sat frozen at the table, his words echoing in the sudden silence of the room. A rare thing. He had called her a rare thing. He had not seen an awkward, oversized woman. He had seen a survivor. He had seen her strength. Later, after the house had gone to sleep, she carried the new tin lamp and the canister of oil up to her small, cold room. She set it on the little table beside her bed. For a long time, she just looked at it. Its dark, solid form, a reassuring presence in the moonlight slanting through the window. Her old brass lamp, her mother's lamp, sat on the washstand. A relic of a past she had been forced to leave behind. This new one felt different. It felt like the future, with deliberate, careful movements. She uncapped the canister and filled the lamp's reservoir with the clear, clean-smelling oil. She trimmed the wick, set the chimney back in its place, and took a match from the small box on the stand. She struck it, and the small, sulphurous flare of the match head was a tiny, defiant star in the darkness. She touched it to the wick. A small, hesitant orange flame appeared, flickered, and then grew into a steady, golden glow. The light pushed back the shadows, filling the small room with a soft, warm radiance. It shone on the simple quilt, on the pages of her neat ledgers, on her own hands. Julia stood in the circle of its light, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. It was the first light that was truly her own, the first she had not been given by birthright or circumstance, but one she had earned through the simple, stubborn act of staying. It was the first light she had truly chosen to keep, and as the wind howled on outside, she sat down on her bed and simply watched it burn. The ledgers, once a chaotic wilderness, were now tamed. They sat in a neat, orderly stack on Julia's small desk at the boarding house, a testament to weeks of meticulous work. The numbers told a story, but she knew it was an incomplete one. A ledger could tell you that 50 sacks of oats had been purchased, but it couldn't tell you if they were moldy from a leak in the storeroom roof. A payroll could tell you a man's name, but not the quality of his work or the strength of his character. It was Elias who voiced the next logical step, though the thought had been forming in her own mind for days. He stood by her desk one afternoon, examining a finished inventory sheet, his brow furrowed in concentration. "These numbers are clean, Miss Arlen," he said, his voice holding a note of quiet wonder. "I've never seen the ranch laid out so plain. It's like a map." He looked up from the paper and met her eyes. "But a map isn't the territory. I need you to come out to the ranch. I need you to put your eyes on the goods, to walk the ground this map describes. I need to know if the map is true." It was not an invitation, but a practical necessity. Yet, the thought of it sent a nervous flutter through Julia's chest. To leave the warm, safe cocoon of May Dunning's kitchen for the rough, masculine world of a working horse ranch felt like a significant and slightly terrifying step. May's was a world of women, of domestic order. The North Slope Ranch was Elias's world, but she looked at the sincerity in his eyes, the simple, trusting way he asked for her help, and she knew she could not refuse. "When do we start?" she asked. The North Slope Ranch was nestled in a wide, wind-swept valley, a collection of sturdy, unadorned buildings that seemed to have grown from the land itself. A long, low bunkhouse for the men, a sprawling barn that smelled deeply of hay and horse, a blacksmith shed from which the rhythmic ring of a hammer echoed, and a small, tidy foreman's cabin that Elias called his own. It was a place of constant, purposeful motion. Men moved with the quiet efficiency of long practice, their talk sparse, their actions direct. Horses, hundreds of them, filled the corrals and dotted the snow-dusted pastures, their breath misting in the cold, clear air. Julia had expected to feel like an intruder, a strange, tall bird in a flock of crows. And for the first day, she did. The hands, a dozen or so weathered men with quiet eyes, would nod to her, their gazes brief and guarded, before turning back to their work. But Elias moved with her, a steady, unassuming presence at her side, and his quiet acceptance of her was a clear, unspoken signal to the others. He was the foreman. She was here on his authority. That was enough. They worked together, their days falling into a new rhythm. She would stand with her clipboard and a pencil, a long wool scarf wrapped around her neck, as Elias and his men roped and led horses from one corral to another for her to count. In the vast, cold storeroom, he would heave heavy sacks of flour and beans onto a scale for her to weigh and record, his muscles straining under the load. She, in turn, found her place in the ranch's ecosystem. The men's gear, she noticed, was often in a state of disrepair. They were skilled with horses and cattle, but clumsy with a needle and thread. In the afternoons, she took to sitting in the relative warmth of the tack room, the scent of leather and saddle soap thick in the air, with the heavy-duty needles and waxed thread she found in a forgotten corner. She began to mend. She repaired torn saddlecloths, their thick wool fabric stiff and heavy in her hands. She restitched the leather straps on bedrolls, her fingers growing strong and calloused. It was not bookkeeping, but it was a different kind of accounting, an accounting of needs met, of small comforts provided. The men never thanked her directly, but she would see a hand run a thumb over a freshly mended seam, or find a cup of hot, sweet coffee left for her on the bench where she worked. They had accepted her. She was no longer just the bookkeeper. She was a practical, useful part of their world. Through all of it, the unspoken thing between her and Elias grew. It was not in words. It was in the small, unconscious gestures of two people learning each other's rhythms. It was in the way he'd appear at her side with a steaming mug just as she started to shiver from the cold. It was in the way she'd learned to anticipate the tool he'd need next, placing it in his hand before he had to ask. They ate their midday meal together, sitting on an overturned trough, their shoulders not quite touching. The silence between them as comfortable and nourishing as the thick bread and cold beef they shared. He spoke to her of the horses, telling her their bloodlines and their temperaments. And she, in turn, spoke to him of the patterns she saw in the numbers, of how a small saving on feed in the autumn could mean the difference between plenty and scarcity in the late spring. No one spoke of feelings, but everyone knew. The men saw it in the way the foreman's gaze would soften when he looked at her, in the way a rare, quiet smile would touch his lips when she pointed out an error in a shipping manifest. May Dunning saw it when they returned to town in the evenings. Their shared silence in her kitchen no longer just comfortable, but charged with a gentle, resonant hum. They were two solitary, self-sufficient people who were, slowly and hesitantly, learning how to be alone together. The day it happened began like any other. The sky was a high, brilliant blue, the air so cold and clear it hurt to breathe. Elias was working with a young gelding, a handsome but nervous bay that was not yet fully broken to the saddle. Julia was standing by the corral fence, verifying the count on a shipment of new branding irons. When she paused to watch him, he was a different man when he was with a horse. All his quiet, contained stillness transformed into a fluid, intuitive grace. He moved with the animal, not against it, his voice a low, calming murmur. But the young horse was unpredictable. A gust of wind sent a piece of loose canvas skittering across the corral floor. The gelding shied violently, its eyes rolling white with fear. It reared, its powerful forelegs flailing the air. Elias caught off balance, held his seat for a half-second, a testament to his skill. But the horse twisted with a brutal, convulsive strength. He was thrown. It was not a spectacular fall. It was a heavy, sickening thud as his body hit the hard, frozen ground. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The horse galloped to the far end of the corral, its sides heaving. The other hands, who had been going about their work, froze in place, and then the world rushed back in. Julia felt a cold, sharp spike of fear pierce her chest, so intense it stole her breath. She saw him try to push himself up, his face a mask of white, shocked pain, before he fell back with a low groan. Two of the other men were already in the corral, moving cautiously to calm the spooked horse while another two ran to Elias's side. Julia was through the fence before she even realized she had moved, her clipboard and papers forgotten in the snow. By the time she reached him, they were helping him to his feet. He was leaning heavily on the other men, his left arm held at a strange, unnatural angle, his face pale and beaded with sweat despite the biting cold. "It's my shoulder," he gritted out through clenched teeth, out of place. The men helped him limp from the corral to his small cabin. It was a sparse, functional space, containing a narrow bed, a simple wooden table, and a small stove. It smelled of wood smoke, leather, and him. They eased him down onto the bed, and Julia's carefully constructed composure threatened to shatter. The sight of this strong, capable man reduced to such a state of helpless pain was a physical blow. One of the older hands, a man named Silas with a kind, wrinkled face, looked from Elias's pale face to Julia's worried one. "I've put a shoulder back in before," he said quietly, "but it ain't pleasant. Best if you wait outside, ma'am." She wanted to refuse, to stay, but she saw the wisdom in it. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak, and stepped back out into the cold, pulling the door almost shut behind her. The next minute was an eternity. She heard a low, terse exchange of words from inside, and then a single sharp cry of pain from Elias that cut through her like a knife. It was followed by a heavy silence. After a moment, Silas opened the door. "It's done," he said, his expression grim. "He needs to rest. The pain will be bad for a while." Julia pushed past him and went back inside. Elias was lying on the bed, his eyes closed, his face slick with sweat. His shirt had been cut away, and his shoulder was already beginning to swell. an ugly, bruised knot of flesh. His arm was now cradled in a makeshift sling. He looked utterly spent. The other men lingered for a moment, their hats in their hands, their concern a palpable thing in the small room, before they quietly filed out, leaving Julia alone with him. She moved automatically, her mind seizing on the practical tasks that needed to be done. She stoked the fire in the stove until the room was warm. She found a clean cloth and gently wiped the sweat from his brow. He didn't open his eyes, but a muscle in his jaw twitched. She fetched a bucket of snow and put it outside the door, then found a spare blanket to pack around it, creating a makeshift ice pack to press against the swelling. For the rest of the day and into the night, she cared for him. She sat in the single straight-backed chair she pulled up beside his bed. He drifted in and out of a restless, pain-filled sleep. When he was awake, she gave him sips of water. She found a half-finished pot of thin coffee on the back of the stove and heated it for him, helping him drink it. She did not feel awkward or out of place. She felt exactly where she was supposed to be. The formal barriers of foreman and bookkeeper had dissolved. They were just Julia and Elias, alone in a quiet room against the vast, cold emptiness of the night. Late that night, the ranch was silent except for the sighing of the wind and the soft crackle of the fire. Elias was awake, his eyes open in the dim light cast by the lamp she had lit on his table. He had not spoken for hours. She was mending the shirt that had been cut from him, her needle moving back and forth in a steady, soothing rhythm, her own exhaustion a dull ache in her bones. He stirred, and she looked up. He was watching her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. He slowly, painfully, moved his good right hand from where it lay on the blanket. He reached across the small space between them. He did not say her name. He did not ask for anything. His hand, large and rough with calluses, simply covered hers, stilling the motion of her needle. It was not a grasp for help. It was not a gesture of need. It was a simple, profound touch of connection. The warmth of his skin against hers was a shock, a sudden point of heat in the quiet, cool room. His thumb moved, just once, a slow, gentle stroke across her knuckles. It was the first time they had truly touched, and in that single, silent gesture, everything that had been unspoken between them was finally said. He was not just holding her hand for comfort. He was holding it, she knew with a sudden, breathtaking certainty, simply to feel that she was there, and she did not pull away. She simply turned her hand in his, her fingers lacing through his, and sat with him in the quiet, lamp-lit dark. The weeks that followed Elias's injury were a time of profound and quiet change. His dislocated shoulder, once set, began the slow, arduous process of mending. The sharp, debilitating pain subsided into a constant, dull ache, and his arm, bound tightly in a sling, became a frustratingly useless appendage. The foreman of the North Slope Ranch, a man whose life was defined by physical competence and tireless work, was forced into a state of stillness, and into that stillness Julia stepped. Their roles, once clearly defined as foreman and bookkeeper, now blurred into a seamless partnership. He could no longer ride the fence lines or break the wild-eyed colts, so he became the eyes and the mind, and she, his hands and his feet. Each morning they would ride out from town together in the buckboard, the winter sun a pale, distant disk in the sky. He would sit beside her, his good hand resting on his knee, and direct her, his voice a low murmur against the crunch of the wheels on the frozen road. "Take the left fork by the creek," he'd say. "There's a section of fence there I've been meaning to check. The snowdrifts get deep in that cut." She would handle the reins, her hands, once soft from city life, now toughened and capable. At the ranch, she moved with a purpose that was entirely new. She was no longer just a visitor in his world. She was an essential part of its function. She relayed his orders to the men, who had quickly grown to respect her clear, direct manner. She oversaw the distribution of feed, her ledgers and inventories, now the undeniable law of the ranch. She walked the grounds, her tall figure a familiar sight against the stark white landscape, her keen eyes missing nothing. This new proximity wove their lives together in 1,000 small, intimate ways. She learned the precise way he liked his coffee, strong and black with no sugar. He learned that she had a wry, quiet sense of humor that only emerged when she was tired. She would read to him in the evenings in his small cabin, her voice a low, steady anchor in the long, dark hours as she went over the accounts or read from a tattered copy of Shakespeare one of the hands had inexplicably left behind. He would watch her, the firelight catching the auburn strands in her hair, his expression one of deep, quiet contentment. The space between them, once a careful, respected distance, had vanished. It was now filled with a shared, unspoken understanding, a partnership forged in necessity and tempered by a deep, mutual respect. Of course, Whitestone noticed, a town like Whitestone, with its long winters and its insular society, ran on observation and speculation. The sight of the North Slope foreman and the tall woman from the east riding into town together, him with his arm in a sling and her handling the team, was a story in itself. It was a story told in glances from behind curtained windows, in whispers over the counter at the general store, in the sudden silences that fell when they entered the hotel for a hot meal. The narrative about Julia Arlen was changing. She was no longer just the oddity Henderson had turned away. She was the woman who had brought order to the chaos of the North Slope's books. She was the woman who was now, for all intents and purposes, running the ranch's daily operations while its foreman healed. Some saw this with respect. They saw her competence, her uncomplaining diligence. But others, whose worlds were built on rigid, established patterns, saw her as a disruption, an unnatural element. Chief among these was Beatrice Croft, Mrs. Croft was a widow of some 10 years, her husband having left her with a small but prosperous freight business and a solid, 2-story house at the edge of town. She saw herself as a gatekeeper of Whitestone's social order, a woman of standing and propriety. She was also a woman who had, in her own subtle and respectable way, set her sights on Elias Boone. He was a capable, unattached man, and his position as foreman made him a valuable, stable prospect. Mrs. Croft had imagined, in time, that she could smooth his rough edges, install him in her late husband's business, and absorb him into her well-ordered life. Julia's arrival, and her subsequent, deepening connection with Elias, was an affront to this plan. It was not just the jealousy of a woman spurned, for nothing had ever been offered, but the deep, righteous indignation of a person whose sense of the proper order of things had been violated. In Mrs. Croft's eyes, Julia was an anomaly too tall, too educated, too quiet, too self-sufficient. She was a circle in a world of squares, and Mrs. Croft did not approve of circles. The confrontation, when it came, was inevitable. It happened on a Tuesday, in the crowded, overheated confines of Gable's General Store. The store was the town's beating heart, a place that smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and damp wool. Julia and Elias had come in for supplies. Elias, weary of being confined to the cabin, had insisted on making the trip. He stood by the door while Julia moved through the store, her list in hand. His useless arm was a constant source of frustration, and he watched, his pride warring with his gratitude, as she easily reached up to a high shelf to retrieve a tin of baking soda, her height for once a simple, practical advantage. It was then that Beatrice Croft made her entrance. She was dressed in a fine, dark wool dress, her posture as rigid as a fence post. She nodded curtly to the various townspeople, her gaze sweeping the store before it landed, with calculated precision, on Julia. She glided over, her movements smooth and deliberate, placing herself directly in Julia's path.
Miss Arlen?
she said, her voice a model of strained politeness.
I trust you are finding our little town to your liking.
It has been most welcoming. Mrs. Croft, Julia replied, her tone even. She had no desire for a confrontation, but she would not shrink from one. Mrs. Croft's eyes flickered over to Elias, who was now watching them, his expression unreadable, and then back to Julia. A small, tight smile touched her lips. One hears you have been making yourself indispensable out at the North Slope. It is so charitable of you to help Mr. Boone in his time of trouble. Men can be so helpless when they are unwell. The words were honeyed, but the sting was in the implication that Julia was a temporary convenience, a nursemaid whose usefulness would expire the moment Ellis's shoulder healed. Julia simply met her gaze.
The work needs doing. I'm able to do it.
This simple, factual response seemed to irritate Mrs. Croft. Her smile tightened. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial, yet carrying whisper that the entire store seemed to lean in to hear. Yes, well, you are certainly capable, she said, drawing the word out. But this is a hard country. Miss Arlen, a hard country for a woman alone, and the men here, they are a particular sort. They value practicality. They have a certain image of the kind of woman who can stand beside them. She paused, letting the silence hang, her gaze sweeping over Julia's tall frame with dismissive appraisal. Tell me, do you truly believe you are a fit for the men of this country? The question was a blade, sharpened by prejudice and honed with malice. It was Lyle Henderson's rejection, rephrased and delivered in a public forum. It was every whispered comment, every sidelong stare she had ever endured, distilled into one poisonous dart. The store fell silent. Everyone was watching, waiting. They were waiting for her to blush, to stammer, to shrink, to apologize for her very existence. But Julia did not shrink. Something inside her, forged in the cold loneliness of the train platform and tempered in the quiet resolve of the past months, solidified into a core of unshakable steel. She felt Elias take a half-step forward, a protective instinct, but she held up a hand, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, stopping him. This was her battle to fight. She drew herself up to her full height, her shoulders straight, her head held high. She looked down, not with arrogance, but with a simple, incontrovertible calm, into Beatrice Croft's hard, expectant eyes. When she spoke, her voice was not loud, but it was as clear and resonant as a bell in the winter air, and it carried to every corner of the silent store. I did not come here to fit a mold. Mrs. Croft, she said, her voice steady and proud, I came here to live. The words were a quiet thunderclap. They were not a defense. They were a declaration. She was not asking for acceptance. She was claiming her own space on her own terms. She had taken Mrs. Croft's petty, personal attack and answered it with a statement of universal, unyielding principle. Beatrice Croft's face, a moment before so smug and confident, crumpled. She had expected tears or anger, a messy, emotional display she could easily triumph over. She had no answer for this calm, unshakable dignity. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, her pale eyes blinking rapidly. For the first time in a long time, the arbiter of Whitestone society was utterly speechless. Into the stunned silence, Mr. Gable, the store's proprietor, cleared his throat loudly. Will there be anything else? Miss Arlen, he asked, his tone deliberately normal. A clear and public siding with her. The spell was broken. A low murmur rippled through the onlookers. Julia turned her back on the sputtering widow and gave Mr. Gable the rest of her order. Elias had not said a word. He simply stood beside her, his presence a solid, unmovable wall of support. His silence was louder than any shout could have been. It said, "She is with me. Her fight is her own, and I have no doubt she will win it." It was the greatest act of faith he could have offered, and she felt a wave of warmth and gratitude wash over her. The news of the exchange traveled through Whitestone faster than a winter brush fire. But this time, the story was different. Martha, the woman whose son's shirt she had mended, told her husband that evening that Mrs. Croft, she's all sharp edges and no substance. Miss Arlen, she's quiet, but she's solid oak. Two of the railroad men, drinking at the saloon, were overheard discussing it. Heard the foreman's bookkeeper stood up to the Croft woman. One said, "Didn't back down an inch. Got spine. That one." The tide of public opinion, which had been a thing of idle curiosity, now shifted decisively in her favor. They were a hard people in a hard country, and they respected strength above all else. They had seen her quiet competence. Now they had seen her unyielding pride. She was no longer an outsider to be gawked at. She had faced down one of their own, in the heart of their town, and she had won. Not with anger, but with dignity. She had earned her place. Later, as they rode back to the ranch in the fading light, the silence in the buckboard was deep and comfortable. The confrontation was not mentioned. It didn't need to be. As they turned onto the long track that led to the ranch, Elias reached across the seat with his good hand and laid it, just for a moment, on her forearm. It was a simple touch, a gesture of profound, unspoken pride. And Julia, looking ahead at the valley she was beginning to call home, felt a sense of peace that was as vast and as clear as the Wyoming sky. She had not come here to fit. She had come here to live. And, for the first time, she truly felt that she was... Winter had settled over the valley with the quiet, final weight of a tombstone. The nights were the hardest. A deep, profound cold that leached the heat from everything, leaving the world brittle and frozen under a sky of brilliant, pitiless stars. Life on the ranch contracted, pulling inward toward the twin warmth of the bunkhouse stove and the hearth in Elias's small cabin. The horses, their coats thick and shaggy, stood huddled in the relative shelter of the barn, their breath pluming in the still, frigid air. On one such night, the silence was absolute. The wind, for once, was still, and the only sound was the faint, rhythmic chewing of the horses in their stalls and the distant, lonely cry of a coyote. Julia and Elias sat in his cabin, a comfortable silence between them. His shoulder, though still tender, was mostly healed. His arm free from the sling for the past week. He was slowly reclaiming his strength, a fact that brought him a deep, quiet satisfaction. He was methodically oiling a bridle, his hands moving with their old, familiar competence. Julia sat at his table, a lamp at her elbow casting a warm, golden circle of light, making a final entry in the weekly expense ledger. A small fire hissed and popped in the stove, a cheerful, domestic sound against the immense, cold silence outside. She had moved out to the ranch a month prior. It had been a practical decision, proposed by May Dunning herself. The daily buckboard rides in the deepening cold were a hardship, and with Elias still not at his full strength, it simply made sense for her to be on site. She took over a small, clean room off the main room of the foreman's cabin, a space that had been used for storage. It was her own now, and with her lamp on the nightstand and her few belongings neatly arranged. It was the first place since Boston that had truly felt like hers. She closed the ledger with a soft thud. "That's everything for the week," she said. "We're still running under budget on feed, thanks to that deal you made with the Miller brothers." Elias looked up from his work, a small, rare smile touching the corners of his mouth. "That's your doing. You're the one who showed me the numbers, proved we could buy in bulk before the first snow." He finished his work and hung the bridle on a peg by the door. "It's getting late. You should get some rest." She nodded, a comfortable weariness settling over her. She stood, stretched, and bid him good night. Retiring to her small room, he remained by the fire, the quiet, steady guardian of the ranch. Julia fell asleep almost instantly, the silence of the valley a peaceful, lulling blanket. The first sign of wrongness was not a sound, but a smell. A faint, acrid scent that wormed its way into her sleep, a smell of smoke that was sharper and more chemical than the familiar, comforting scent of wood smoke from the stove. She stirred, half awake, her mind trying to place it. Then came the sound, a low, crackling roar that was not the wind, and something else beneath it, a sound of pure terror, the high-pitched, frantic screaming of horses. The world exploded. Julia was out of bed in an instant, her heart a frantic, hammering drum against her ribs. She pulled on her boots and a heavy wool coat over her nightdress, her mind still struggling to catch up with her body's instinctive reaction. She threw open her door and the heat hit her like a physical blow. The main room of the cabin was filled with a hellish, flickering orange light. Through the single window, she saw it. The barn, their big sprawling barn, the heart of the ranch, was a volcano of fire. A hellscape of roaring flame and thick, black smoke pouring into the pristine, star-filled sky. Elias was already gone. The cabin door was wide open, swinging slightly in the terrible, hot draft created by the inferno. She ran outside. The intense cold of the air a shocking contrast to the searing heat that washed over her from the burning building. The scene was one of utter chaos. The ranch hands, alerted by the roar and the light, were pouring out of the bunkhouse, their faces stark with disbelief and horror in the ghastly light. And then she saw Elias. He was not fighting the fire. He was fighting for the horses. He and two other men were at the main doors of the barn, which were already wreathed in flame, struggling to drag them open against the intense heat. The screaming of the animals inside was a sound that would be seared into her memory forever. It was a sound of absolute, agonizing panic. "The doors are jammed!" Someone shouted over the roar. "The heat's warped the track!" Elias didn't hesitate. He grabbed a heavy axe that was leaning against the cabin wall. The back stalls he yelled, his voice raw and powerful. Cutting through the din, break through the back wall, get him out. He ran toward the far side of the barn, the side least consumed by the flames, his movements economical and fiercely focused. He was a man possessed by a single, desperate purpose. Julia stood frozen for only a second, a helpless spectator to the unfolding nightmare. Then, her own mind snapped into focus. Panic was a luxury they could not afford. She ran toward the bunkhouse, her long legs eating up the ground. "Buckets!" she shouted, her voice high and clear. The well form a line. The men, momentarily paralyzed by the scale of the disaster, were galvanized by her command. It was a clear, practical order in the midst of madness. They grabbed buckets, axes, anything they could find, and a frantic, desperate bucket brigade formed, stretching from the hand-pumped well to the bunkhouse and the foreman's cabin, which were now directly threatened by the flying, incandescent embers. Julia took her place in the line, her hands, which had so recently held a delicate pen, now raw and clumsy on the rough wood and metal of the buckets. The work was brutal, punishing. The water was numbingly cold, the heat from the fire a searing, physical presence that blistered her skin. The smoke was a thick, choking blanket that tore at her lungs and made her eyes stream. She worked, her body a machine, taking a full bucket, passing it on. Taking the next, she was shoulder to shoulder with the ranch hands, their faces grim and soot-streaked, their shared, desperate effort, a silent bond between them. She kept her eyes on the back of the barn, where Elias and the others were working with a frantic energy. She could hear the splintering crash of an axe against wood. Punctuated by the terrified shrieks of the horses, a section of the wall gave way, and a dark shape, a horse mad with terror, bolted out into the night, its mane seeming to smoke. Another followed, and then another. The men were creating a breach, a path to survival. Elias was a silhouette against the flames, a figure of incredible, reckless bravery. He plunged into the breach he had helped create, into the smoke-filled, burning interior, to drive the last, most panicked horses out. He emerged moments later, slapping the rump of a terrified mare, his clothes smoldering, his face black with soot. He had gotten them all out, or almost all of them. And then, with a terrible, groaning shriek of tortured wood, the main roof beam of the barn gave way. It fell inward with a deafening crash, sending a mushroom cloud of sparks and embers soaring into the sky. A section of the burning hayloft collapsed outward, and a heavy, flaming timber, a piece of the roof itself, fell from the sky. Julia screamed his name, Elias. The burning beam caught him a glancing blow across his back and legs, sending him sprawling to the ground. He cried out, a sharp, guttural sound of pain, and tried to rise, but his leg was trapped. Silas, the old, steady hand, was the first to reach him, beating at the flames on his clothes with his own coat. 2 others followed, heaving the heavy, smoldering timber off his leg. They half dragged, half carried him away from the collapsing structure, away from the furnace-like heat, and laid him on the frozen ground a safe distance away. Julia left the bucket line and ran to him. His face was contorted in pain, but his eyes were open, fixed on the dying building. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, the thick denim of his trousers scorched and smoking. His back was a mass of angry, blistering burns, but he was alive.
The horses,
he gasped, his voice a raw whisper.
Are they all out?
You got 'em, Elias, Silas said, his voice thick with emotion.
You got 'em all.
There was nothing more to be done for the barn. It was a total loss, a funeral pyre against the night sky. The fight now was to save the other buildings, to keep the fire from consuming everything they had. Julia, her heart a cold, hard knot of fear for Elias, knew she could not stop. He was hurt, but the ranch itself was dying. She rejoined the bucket line, her movements mechanical, her mind a blank slate of grief and grim determination. They worked until their muscles screamed, until their lungs felt raw, until the very thought of lifting another bucket was an agony. The dawn came slowly, a pale, reluctant light that crept over the eastern mountains. The new day revealed a scene of utter devastation. Where the proud barn had stood was a black, smoking, skeletal ruin, its charred timbers clawing at the sky. The ground was a churned mess of snow, mud, and ash. The surviving horses were scattered in the far pastures, their sides still heaving, their eyes wide with the memory of terror. Elias lay on a makeshift bed in the bunkhouse, his legs splinted, his back bandaged, a bottle of whiskey his only medicine against the searing pain. He had refused to be moved to his own cabin, wanting to be with his men. As the sun rose higher, wagons began to arrive from Whitestone. The glow of the fire had been visible for miles, a terrible beacon in the night. The townspeople came, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and genuine concern. They gathered in small, quiet groups, staring at the ruin, shaking their heads, their voices low and hushed. Lyle Henderson was there, his face grim. Beatrice Croft was there, her usual air of superiority replaced by a look of shocked disbelief. They saw Julia. She was not crying. She was not wringing her hands in despair. She was covered in soot, her hair a wild tangle, her face smudged and pale with exhaustion. A nasty burn marked one of her forearms. She looked not like a lady, not like a bookkeeper, but like a soldier after a long and brutal battle. While the others stood and stared, she moved. She walked with a stiff, aching gait to Elias's cabin, which had been saved by their efforts. She emerged a moment later with one of her clean ledgers and a pencil. She ignored the watching townspeople, her focus absolute. She walked over to Silas. "Silas," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. "I need a full accounting. How many horses lost? I counted 3 that didn't make it out. Is that right?" The old hand nodded, his eyes full of respect. "Yes, ma'am. 3 of the new colts." And equipment, she continued. "How many saddles? How much tack all the winter hay is gone?" "Correct." She made a neat, precise note in her ledger. "We need to start rebuilding the corral fence first. Some of the posts are still solid. Silas, Can you get a team of men on that? We need to contain the stock." She moved to another group of hands. "I need statements," she said, her voice carrying in the crisp morning air. "I need to know everything you saw. When the fire started, where it started. Did you see anyone, hear anything?" One of the younger hands looked at the ground. "It started in the hayloft. Ma'am, on the north side. Went up like a torch. It ain't natural. A fire like this. It don't just start itself in a frozen barn." The suspicion that had been a dark, unspoken thought now hung in the air. This was not just a tragedy. It was an attack. Julia made another note, her face a mask of grim concentration. She was not just a victim of this disaster. She was its chronicler, its investigator, and the architect of its recovery. She was a pillar of calm, practical strength in the midst of the wreckage. The townspeople watched, their murmurs now a low buzz of astonishment and admiration. They saw the soot on her face, the burn on her arm, the exhaustion in her posture. But they also saw the straightness of her spine, the authority in her voice, the unyielding purpose in her eyes. The fire had taken their barn, but it had revealed her character in the starkest possible terms. She had not been saved or protected. She had fought, shoulder to shoulder with the men. And now, in the cold light of day, while men twice her size stood in shocked inaction, she was the one taking charge, the one rebuilding. Elias, from the doorway of the bunkhouse where two of his men had helped him stand, watched her. A wave of fierce, aching pride washed over him, so powerful it eclipsed the pain in his leg. He saw what everyone else was seeing. The fire had burned away any last lingering questions about who she was or where she belonged. She was not the woman from the east anymore. She was the woman of the North Slope. She was a part of this place, forged in its hardships, tempered in its fire, and she was not leaving. The days that followed the fire were a blur of grim, relentless work. A strange new energy took hold of the North Slope Ranch, the frenetic, purposeful energy that follows a great disaster. The air, thick with the smell of charred wood and wet ash, also carried the clean, sharp scent of newly sawn pine. The silence of the valley was broken by the rhythmic pounding of hammers, the shouts of men, and the grating sound of saws. The ruin of the barn was a constant, gaping wound in the center of their world. But all around it, life, stubborn and resilient, was already beginning to rebuild. Help came, after the townspeople had their fill of staring at the wreckage. A different kind of visitor began to arrive. Farmers from neighboring valleys, men who understood the existential terror of losing a barn in the dead of winter, arrived with wagons loaded with hay. Mr. Gable from the general store extended a line of credit for tools and supplies without being asked. Even Lyle Henderson, his face a mask of grim propriety, sent two of his own men over for a week, a silent, grudging admission of respect. They were a community bound not by affection, but by a shared, unspoken understanding of the harsh realities of the land. A blow against one was a threat to them all. At the center of this whirlwind of activity was Julia. She was the still point around which everything turned. She moved through the chaos with a quiet, unshakable purpose that was more effective than any shouted order. Her ledger was her scepter, her pencil her sword. She directed the flow of donated supplies, her mind a flawless steel trap of inventories and needs. She recorded every hour of labor, every nail used, every plank of wood laid. She took the statements of the men, her questions gentle but probing, building a quiet case against the unknown arsonist who had torn their world apart. She was no longer the bookkeeper. She was the quartermaster, the planner, the memory of the ranch. The men who had first accepted her out of respect for Elias now followed her own authority without question. They saw the tireless strength in her, the way she worked from before sunrise until long after the exhausted crews had retired to the bunkhouse. They saw the burn on her arm, which she treated with a simple salve and never complained about. They saw her, and they knew she was one of them. Elias was confined to his cabin, a frustrated lion in a cage. His leg was healing, but the broken bone demanded stillness, a concept that was alien to his very nature. He would sit propped up on his bed, or in the chair by the window, and watch the slow, arduous process of rebuilding. He watched Julia, a constant, tall figure moving through the snow and mud, and a complex mixture of pride, helplessness, and a deep, aching tenderness would war within him. She was doing his job. She was saving his world, and all he could do was watch. On the third night after the fire, the last of the neighboring helpers had gone home. A quiet exhaustion had settled over the ranch. A temporary corral had been finished. The horses were secure, and a foundation for a new, smaller barn had been laid. It was a small victory, but a vital one. Julia finished her final accounting for the day in the bunkhouse, which now served as the communal hall and office. The air was thick with the smell of tired men, wet wool, and boiled coffee. When she was done, she took the new tin lamp, the one Elias had given her, from the corner where she now kept it. Its light was a small, steady comfort in the weary darkness. She walked across the frozen, moonlit ground to his cabin. She entered without knocking, their relationship having moved far beyond such formalities. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, his splinted legs stretched out stiffly before him. He had been staring out the window at the black, skeletal ruin of the barn, his face etched with a deep, weary sorrow in the pale moonlight. He looked up as she came in, the warm, golden light of her lamp pushing back the shadows. She placed the lamp on the table beside his bed, its glow softening the harsh lines of the small, Spartan room. She said nothing, simply began her quiet, evening ritual of checking on him. She stirred the fire in the stove, adding a fresh log. She refilled the water pitcher on his washstand. They were small, domestic acts, a quiet assertion of order and care in the face of the vast, violent chaos they had endured. When she was finished, she turned back to him. He was still watching her, his expression unreadable.
"The new corral is holding strong,"
she said, her voice soft.
"Silas thinks we can begin raising the main posts for the new barn by the end of the week. The Miller brothers sent another wagon of feed."
He nodded, but his eyes were not on her. They were on his own hands, lying uselessly in his lap. "I heard the hammers today," he said, his voice a low, rough thing, all day, while I sat here. She could feel the raw edge of his frustration, the bitter taste of his own helplessness. She came and stood before him, her presence a quiet comfort. "You need to heal. Elias," she said gently. "The work will be here. The men are good. They know what to do." "You know what to do," he corrected her, finally looking up. His gaze was raw, stripped of all its usual defenses. "They're following you, Julia, and they're right to. I watch you out there. And He trailed off, shaking his head, unable to find the words. He looked around the small cabin, at the simple, worn possessions that constituted his life savings. He looked down at his broken leg, at his burned, bandaged back that still sent waves of fire through him if he moved the wrong way. He looked at the ruin outside the window, the sum of his life's work turned to ash. And then he looked at her, standing tall and whole and strong in the lamplight, a beacon of competence in the wreckage of his world. "I don't know what I have to offer you," he said, the words a raw, painful confession, torn from the deepest part of him. "The ranch is half gone. The owner back east. He might just sell the land for scrap after this. I'm a foreman with nothing to manage. I'm a cripple in a burned-out valley. I have nothing." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of a man's pride brought to its lowest ebb. He was laying himself bare before her, showing her the full extent of his ruin, expecting her, perhaps, to finally turn away, to seek a safer harbor. Julia looked at him, at his proud, humbled face, and her heart ached with a love so fierce and so pure it almost took her breath away. She saw not the ruin, but the man who had faced down a fire to save his animals, The man who had seen her, truly seen her, when no one else had. The man who had given her a place to stand. She knelt before him, a slow, graceful movement, so that their eyes were level. She took his large, calloused hand in both of hers. It was the hand that had held hers in the night as he lay in pain. The hand that had touched her arm in a gesture of silent pride. "You have everything, Elias," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she no longer tried to hide. He had given her a home, not of wood and nails, but of purpose and acceptance. He had given her a name that was not defined by her height or her past. He had given her a place to stay. She looked into his pained, questioning eyes and gave him the only truth that mattered. "Just stay," she said. "That's all I need. Just you." A single, difficult tear traced a path through the soot that was still faintly ingrained in his cheek. He tightened his grip on her hands, his touch a desperate, grateful anchor. "When I first saw you," he said, his voice a ragged whisper, "on that hill, you asked me why I helped you, and later I told you it was because you stayed. I didn't know the half of it then." He looked into her eyes, and in their clear, steady depths, he found his own strength reflected back at him. "You asked Henderson, in your heart. Why not me? You asked me, in the dark. Why me?" He took a slow, shuddering breath, the truth of it all finally becoming clear to him in a wave of painful, beautiful clarity. "The answer to both is the same. It was you because you didn't leave when I had nothing left. You ran toward the fire. Julia, everyone else was just watching it burn." He reached up with his other hand, his fingers gently touching her cheek. It was a touch of reverence, of wonder. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a moment, absorbing the simple, profound truth of his words. He had not chosen her in his strength, but in his brokenness. He had seen her worth most clearly when he had lost everything of his own. She opened her eyes, her gaze clear and full of a quiet, radiant hope. She reached over and her fingers found the small metal key on the side of the lamp. With a soft click, she turned up the wick. The flame grew, rising from a gentle glow to a bright, confident light. It pushed back the shadows to the very corners of the room. It illuminated their faces, his etched with pain and newfound peace, hers with love and unwavering resolve. It cast the ruin outside into deeper darkness, making the small, warm cabin the only world that mattered. And this time, they sat together in its brilliant, hopeful light. Thank you for listening to this story. We would love to hear from you. So please comment below and let us know where you are listening from in the world. To join our community and never miss a tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. If you enjoyed this story, give it a like and support us further by pressing the hype button to help it be heard by more people.